So this is one of the more obscure topics, but I felt like it really falls in line with the recent topic, so I had to cover it. We got another thread. They say, how many phantasms can one heroic spirit have? And if they can be summoned as multiple classes, does the phantasm change, or is it the same for every class? By the way, if you haven't already, make sure you guys sign up for the Patreon. You get access to early content and priority on your request. It's been pretty firmly established, even back in the days of just Stay Night, that what a servant receives in terms of their skills, in terms of their abilities, and most importantly their phantasm, is highly influenced by the conception of their spirit. For a regular hero, mainly it's just a portion of the life that they come from. So that may be the beginning of their life, the pinnacle of their life, or the latter half when things started to go downhill. Maybe they're an older spirit. There's many different people that you can use for an example of this. You know, all the time we bring up David and the way that he appears. He's a vanilla servant. He comes to us as an archer, but at the same time, he was still in his younger years in the form that we got him in, mainly having his sling when he faced against Goliath. But if we got a different version of David, I don't know if people realize this or not, but Galahad actually has David's sword. That being Galahad Altar from Fate Requiem. He has the Sword of Strange Hangings. This is a sword that belonged to David, but since David isn't in the proper class, since he doesn't come from the proper time of his life where the sword takes precedence, we never get to see him using it. And that's just one of many. Gilgamesh and his two forms, and what they decided to give him between his former life as an archer and his pinnacle as the wise king and being a caster, where mentally he's more grounded, and a lot of this is in alignment to the reason that he gets into that caster form. Everything is all about the build. Really, what's unspoken is that a lot of it is to keep it fair for everybody else. Because if we're being realistic, if all of the things belong to the person, then they should have all of the things regardless, but then the story would be skewed. So they try to keep these things isolated to a particular class to make it more balanced. And the reason why I felt this topic was relevant in the first place is because we're coming off the back of the Dream matchup where I introduced Dream Spirits, and it's basically something that I made specifically for our matches where a servant keeps their base skills and abilities, but they're allowed access to their equipment and their phantasms across multiple classes, if they even have that to begin with. And it's just something that I introduced to add more variety to the matchup. It's just there to make it more exciting, but it is definitely something that I would like to see if Type Moon was able to paint a scenario, maybe not even a real Grail War, but just a scenario where we can see everybody have all of their things and not have them separated for the sake of the narrative. Because you could really get not only some dope interactions, but you get to experience the whole thing and not just a part of it the way that we do now. You have some servants that have 3 phantasms, like Saber for instance. She has Excalibur, Invisible Air, and Avalon. Some people try to use Avalon against her because the way that the story is written, she wasn't summoned with it. It ends up in Cheryl's body, whatever. The armament is still hers, and it still canonically ends up in her possession. And then you have people like Perseus, who unfortunately, since he's in Prototype, he doesn't get that much light, that has 6 phantasms. Because remember, he's the one that took down Gorgon. He took down Medusa. And so he has all of these different things that are catered to him doing that in his life. As far as phantasms go, he's probably one of the ones that are treated the most fairly and has some of the most phantasms. He has Bellerophon, he has the heart, he has Cabesus, he has the winged sandals, he has the mirror shield, he has his mantle. But again, he comes from Prototype. Is one of the rare occasions where having all of these things in one portion of his life was actually a real circumstance. Like he literally had to have all of these things at one time in order to complete the job. So it's not even surprising from his perspective. Here's the first comment. A heroic spirit doesn't have a limit to their MPs, their servant does. That being their servant servant container. The limit of a servant comes down to the class that they're summoned in, and sometimes the characteristics that are highlighted in their summoned form. Weapon-based MPs are generally more restricted, while conceptual-based MPs could potentially be preserved in any class and may change on said classes. King Arthur has a set of weapons which can only be used in specific classes. Excalibur for Saber and Rongo for Lancer. Exactly, and that's something that I just pointed out. King Arthur should have all of that. As a matter of fact, mid-fight, we know that Arthur switched between Phantasms depending on what was happening between the war, between the fight against Vortigern. That's why, considering the situation with Arturia, with Avalon, it being a divine construct, even though it belongs to her, you often see that taken away from her, especially in the original story, because they know the moment that she gets it, she's dogging people out, and you can't write a story that way. So the character is built upon the narrative of her being summoned when she lost it. But if that's the case, she wouldn't have Excalibur either, because canonically she made Bedivere return the sword. But you know, it's for the story, it's cool. I don't hyper focus on things like that because I know what it's there for, but a lot of people don't. And so when you see people weigh out these matchups, they try to take it away from her the same way the story took it away from her to make it fair for everybody else. But there's plenty of servants that also lost their things and they're still summoned with them, so you can kind of see the agenda for what it is. But having her running around with Avalon would be bad business for everybody, and I think everybody knows that. It should be fairly obvious where it stands in the verse. That's not good reads, because then it's gonna be like, well, how does she ever lose? And if she does lose, it's gonna be like, well, she got bullshitted to lose. So in order to get rid of that headache altogether, they saw it more suitable for her to just not have it unless she absolutely needed it, like her second fight against Gilgamesh, to show that disparity in strength of how she's really supposed to be. Heracles has 9 lives, a conceptual NP, which can be applied to any weapon he is summoned with. So it changes per class because it's either applied to a mace, a sword, an axe, arrows, or spears. Then you have Vlad. He has the NP Khazikli Bey, which is the concept of being impaled by the impaler. And its changes per class are merely the nature of any extra damage of said NP due to what is highlighted in the summon. We know that Extra Vlad is highlighting the Zealot Christian, Apocrypha Vlad is highlighting the Romanian Heroic King, Berserker Vlad is highlighting Dracula. And so they're all exhibiting different things, but you can see the potential in these characters. And this just goes to show what a person could be like if they had all of these things. Like Vlad would also be Dracula, he would also be the Impaler, it would be real bad. Essentially, when you think about it, the Dream Spirit kind of just capitalizes on a video I did before, what a person's max potential is. That person's max potential will always be them having all of their things. The likes of Emiya and Gilgamesh, or even Enkidu, presents an untold number of weapons based on NPs, but that is due to them possessing a single conceptual NP that grants multiple that are weapon based. Yeah, and I saw somebody else try to bring in people like Shiro and Emiya on a technicality. Technically, they don't have phantasms, except Shiro having Avalon. And I don't even know if you want to say that Shiro has that, considering that it's inside of him. And it's more so of a passive effect rather than an active one. But he does have that as a part of his character. So if we were to get an actual Shiro as a servant, at least base Shiro, that should be a part of his kit. But at the same time, as far as actual NPs go, Shiro doesn't have an actual physical NP. His entire phantasm is stealing everybody else's phantasm. He has armaments like Khonsho and Bakia, but his main phantasm is the Unlimited Blade Works and everything that him and Emiya can pull from that. It says the innate bounded field wielded by Emiya. It is his ability as a heroic spirit with no noble phantasms. The inside of the reality marble is a world like a steel mill filled with weapons, flames, and giant gears. So it works as a stand-in. And that's why I really want to see what happens in Post Stay Night or Fate Stay Night 2, that Shiro that took his own path, may possibly get his own phantasm in the physical form. In general, they can have as many noble phantasms as their legend is associated with. Most servants have one or two, but there's no theoretical upper cap. It's just simply most stories usually have a few fundamental identifiable concepts that survive. And some MPs are locked by class. Krana can only use Shakti as a lancer, but he can use his Vidya as an archer. Some MPs are flexible. The Brahmastra can take any form necessary, as Rama's sword for example, but is strongest as an arrow, which again, Krana also has Brahmastra, but you see that it comes out as a projectile. Same MP, two different forms. Presumably, as long as the MP is still associated with the aspect of the heroic spirit, it'd be good. But otherwise, the whole point of the class system is to restrict the power of the heroic spirit. Yeah, as much as I would love to see it, and again, I still do want to see them at least try to do some type of spin-off in that way. You can't have everybody running around with all their things because it's going to be straight mayhem. It's going to be chaos. The main reason that the story even works is because these servants are restricted. Because like I was saying in the other topic, everybody doesn't have the same stature of myth. So if you get somebody that doesn't have MPs and then you get this other person that has like 10, well, that other person is going to be asked out by default. But if you restrict the both of them, you can entertain the idea of the fight at least coming close. Servants like Achilles, for instance, he was brought up. He has a lot of his phantasms. Not only does he have his reality marble, which is something that they spotted him, they didn't even have to give him that, but I'm glad he does. He has his spear, he has his chariot, he has his shield, his immortality, his speed. Remember Apocrypha and the way that it worked. The man had his shield the entire time. His shield wasn't even locked, and he ended up giving it to Astolfo so they could survive Krana. It all boils down to the way that the story works, because he really could have just kept his phantasm and dog walked everybody, but that's not the point that the story was trying to make. It's not always about that. But everybody knows, if you looked into the details of just Achilles' shield, how broken it is. And I made that apparent when we did the Argonauts versus the Round Table matchup. Here's another one. As many as they have stuff that qualifies for MP status. If a heroic spirit had 100 swords and they were all famous and powerful swords associated with them, then they would have 100 MPs for just swords alone. You see how this becomes a lot more complicated if you don't just bring them down to some. When summoned as a servant, they generally are restricted to MPs that are associated with the particular class. Artoria, as the best example, does not have Excalibur as a lancer and can't use Rongo as a saber. If she was summoned as an archer, she'd likely have whatever famous bow and not Excalibur or Rongo mini. And that's a main function of just being a top 5 round member in general. All of them were good with everything. That's just a part of what being their knightly status was. It wasn't just they were good with this because they're using a bow now. Like Tristan, for example, just because he's using Fail Not doesn't mean that he's not good with a sword. He can also just be summoned as a saber. That's just a part of his background that is highlighting. Things like Myrmidons technically have been described to not be phantasms. They're mythological mystic codes, but they are in that same realm. And so you would have to take those into account too, because you would have to give that servant those also. It would probably be a phantasm in the possession of Hurt because it's actually his. But when Artoria had it, it was just a code. People like Rama, where he's pretty restricted because he prioritizes in a bow and he's supposed to have an abundance of things, but he only has some of them, and we don't even get to see him use those. Just because you see Cucullin using his Gable doesn't mean that he has his Sword of Light that you see in his Satanta variant, when he really should have both. But that's the part of the background that Satanta highlights, and so that's what they gave him. Not that Ku having all of his weapons would matter anyway, because he gets shafted regardless. But you get what I mean. And we've seen Satanta, for the most part, do better than Ku. if that tells you anything. I've seen people bring up servants like Astolfo, who have multiple phantasms like Perseus. And in his case, most of these phantasms aren't even his. But since he had them in his background and what's being highlighted is the journey, is something that gets accepted as he comes into the story because that's really a part of who he was. So there's many caveats to get into when you consider what a servant has, what they come into the war with, and just how many the actual name engraved in the Throne of Heroes has in totality, because it can get way worse. And I'm more so just speaking to physical phantasms that existed in the real world, or at least were heard of in myth. This doesn't even include conceptual phantasms like they brought up, where you could get real wild. Damn near everybody would have some type of reality marble or reality warping situation just off the strength. There's a part of Lancelot's lore that doesn't get highlighted in the story, that being his magical ring. If you remember that from his myth, that straight up cancels out spells. And we don't know what level Type Moon would bring this to, but since it was given to him by the Lady of the Lake, you can already imagine how difficult it would be to write him going down, because anything that the Lady of the Lake gives out is busted, and we all know that. So you got to give them some leg room for that. So once again, as I always say, a lot of these guys are nerfed. They start off nerfed, they go into the story nerfed, and then they get nerfed in the story. So it's like there's so many things that are being put into place to make it a realistic circumstance for everybody else, and also get the point across, because at the end of the day, that's the most important thing, is getting the point across. It's okay for Astolfo to have all of these phantasms because none of them are like Holy Sword level armaments, so it's not that big of a deal for most people. But then you have things like his grimoire, his hippogriff, where in the hands of somebody else would be really devastating. I mean, this man was literally cheesing whole laser blasts thanks to his MP, to the point where even Karna had to give his compliments, because at face value, it doesn't seem like he would be capable of doing such things. Here's another. It depends on the servant. If they have many feats, then they're going to have a lot, like Achilles, who just has them as his in-game skills instead of his actual ones. They're also limited in their current class in the aspect that they're betraying. And this just goes back into how much it heavily correlates to their influence in their background in order to make this work. If you got a guy that's hardly known, he's probably not going to have much, depending on the way that he's written. Whereas you might have somebody with an extreme amount of popularity, well then they have too many things and they have too many stories, and then they have to be downgraded. And we saw this with Herc and him being one of the strongest heroes to exist. His downgrade, Nasu stuffs him into the Berserker class and takes his rationale, takes his weapons, takes his phantasms. His axe isn't even a real phantasm, it's just a random axe. It was the only thing that could make it fair. And then you see Alcides, where he's more so not restricted, and we've been through this on his Don't Sleep. Alcides probably has around 15 phantasms just off the dome. He has the 12 labors, that's 12. He has 9 lives, 13. He has Pandora, which is the phantasm that allows him to steal phantasms. And then for 15, you could really say it's whatever phantasm that he stole. So just using these characters alone, for example, phantasms can span from 2 to 15 to whatever. But we definitely got to circle back around to this and find out who has the most, who has the least, who should have the most, and vice versa. Maybe we can do a segment where we isolate all the servants that have this many. These group of servants have 3. This group has 4, so on and so forth. Who has the most physical? Who has the most conceptuals? That in and of itself sounds like really interesting topics on their own.